So my family and I were loaded up in this Cherokee that I used to fly to our cottage. So we pull it out, do a quick pre-flight on it, all the normal stuff, control surfaces, fuel, oil, drain the sumps, just a general condition inspection. Make sure everything's still hooked up right and moving right. It wasn't a hack thing. Like, I did a pre-flight, right? Okay. So we go get in, we load all our stuff, get the kids loaded in, and we go in, and I do the normal pre-flight checks, like in the interior, get the DG set up and make sure everything's good and erect and correct and all the normal stuff, get the GPS going and make sure the frequencies are right, the volume's good, audio panel set up. I check the fuel selector, I check fuel proper tank, and then so I take the fuel selector, and so this is right after I start up, like 30 seconds or less after I start up. I'm looking, basically engine starts, I'm looking for oil pressure, make sure everything's good, quick scan, set my DG or my heading indicator, and fuel selector valve on the fullest tank. So I do that, we get taxiing. We weren't even moving yet, right? So we get moving, taxiing. It's a pretty short taxi, but not like the runway's right there. And I do a run-up, mag check, carb heat test. Everything's good. Check oil pressure again, oil temperature. And then I bring from 2,000 RPM, which where I did the mag check and the carb heat test, I bring the power back and to idle, just to make sure it will idle. I want to make sure it's a good idle, and that's typically kind of my sign that it's warm enough for takeoff. We weren't registering much oil temp yet. So then, as I recommend to all of my students, primary students, when you're going to go do your first flight of the day, basically treat that takeoff like a maximum performance takeoff. If you haven't flown in a while and the airplane sat, this, that, the other thing. So I do a static, brakes are set. I'm holding the brakes. We're on the runway now, lined up to take off. I do full power, check gauges, brakes release, get rolling down the runway, get about to rotation. I saw about 50, 55. I had already started pulling engine quits.
Really?
Yep. In a
Holy cow.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought, because my family's sitting right behind me. And I noticed as I brought the power back from full to idle, so there's somebody in the pattern. I can't really, I'm not good at storytelling, so that's why I suck. But, so when I know there's a bonanza in the pattern, but in the moment, the engine just failed. I'm coasting down the runway, 50 miles an hour probably by this point. I'm trying to think, okay, it just rained, a shitload of rain. I don't want to take this thing off the side of the runway because it's going to get stuck, and because it's low spots on both sides. So I'm thinking this guy's gonna, and it's strong out of the north on this day, the runway I was using. So I know they want to use this runway. I don't want to ditch it in the side of the, off the side of the runway. But I noticed when I bring it from idle, or from full power to idle, that the engine kind of does like a little hiccup and picks up power again. I'm like, well, what's going on there? So I jam it in again, and the accelerator pump squirts fuel back in. So I basically accelerator pump. So I'm just running throttle open and closed to keep the engine at least turning over to give me enough thrust. And I'm really working this throttle to keep enough in, or RPM in, to give me thrust to get off the runway at least. So I get clear of the runway, and it was pretty long run. Probably like, I don't know, maybe 3,000 feet to the first turnoff. So I get there, and the fuel selector rattled, not necessarily too off, but off enough that it was. So when I reset it in the detent, it was off just a little bit. It was a brand new fuel selector. I've flown the airplane. It's been flown several times since the fuel selector is installed, but it's really, I don't want to call it loose. It's very fluid. It's the way I want it to work, but I just wasn't precise enough in my placement of it when I did my fuel proper tank. And it was on the proper tank, but I always move it and then move it back. I don't know why I do that. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but I like that. I like to make sure that it's in the detent. But in this case, it was just off enough, and it rattled off of that detent just enough, some way or another, or I bumped it and cut out. And it's just like the stupidest, simplest thing. could have got me. What if that would have happened a minute later, minute later,
Right. Yeah.
or 30 seconds later?
30 seconds later.
So it's like one of those things. All these things go through your mind, and it's like such a freak occurrence, but it could have been a freak accident. Is really, really crazy.
So did you all get back in the plane and take back?
We never
off?
got out of the plane. I was very confident, and then what I did is I did a longer. Once I got it firmly, and I wiggled it both ways from the detent to make sure I was like firmly in the detent, better than I was the first time apparently. Firmly in that detent, no slop either side. It was perfect. Then I did another full power run up, did another mag check, another carb heat, and I let it basically run at like 1,000 RPM for, I don't know, probably 45 seconds to a minute, guessing. I was confident that the fuel lines everything was fine. So it's just the time it took from when I started up the engine to taxiing out, even doing a mag check, and then doing a full power run up, checking gauges, and then brakes release, and then get all the way to 50 miles an hour going down the runway. And all of that's what the fuel that was in the line.
Yeah.
With the fuel selector,
you go a long
I guess
way
I
with
don't,
that.
and I guess I don't know when it rattled fully from just off the detent to off enough to quit the engine. I guess I don't know when that happened exactly, but I'm assuming it's when I placed it not firmly enough in the detent, or shortly after that, from the taxiing, the bouncing and harmonics of the taxi, I think is what I presume did it, but I don't know for a fact. So I guess I don't know when that is, but in my mind, I'm thinking that it happened around when I thought I was placing it in the detent. And if that's the case, I mean, it was probably a solid 2 minutes.
Yeah. You could probably go 2 minutes after you shut the fuel off, I would imagine.
Yeah. But a lot of that 2 minutes was already at a 2,000 RPM for the run-up.
Yeah, that's true.
Taxiing.
Yeah.
And then I did a full power static run-up on the runway and then went to 50 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a fair amount of fuel consumption.
Your
And
wife
then-
wasn't concerned about taking off after that?
She was like, we're good, right? It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
pretty sure.
Okay. Yeah, Nicole would have been. She'd have been out of that plane and never back in it again.
Well, I'm glad it didn't happen to her then.
Yeah.
Normally I would have been a lot more like, hey, we need to look at this thing, all that kind of stuff. But I was so sure because when I grabbed that fuel selector and I'm like, when I looked at it, because there's a little bit of that parallax error, like I could kind of see the line where the detent would be, and I'm looking at it because you're high above it and off to the side in a Piper. It's on the left sidewall, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, man, that looks on the line. So I take it and I just give it a little bit of pressure back towards the line. It goes click. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. And so then of course I did a longer run up and a high power run up and all that stuff again, and gave it a solid 45 seconds to a minute at idle just to make sure as best I could that everything was good. And I was pretty confident I found the source. If I wasn't confident that I had found the source, I would have treated it completely different. Let's take it back, carb, look at, make sure the primer system isn't, bleeding in there. Like, I had no idea at the time. And that's just one of those things. Like, I can talk, we can talk, everybody can talk about like what you do when, and it's like, I use the accelerator pump to get enough fuel out of the fuel bowl or whatever to get, well, that's the primer, I guess. But I used the accelerator pump to keep the engine running, to get clear of the runway. Like, I didn't think about like, in the air, I typically teach like a flow. You have an engine failure, carb mixture, primer, fuel proper tank. Those are kind of your big ticket items. I didn't think any of that stuff. I didn't think any of that rolling down, and I'm on the ground. I'm already on the ground, about as safe can be, all things considered, and none of those things crossed my mind. And maybe if I had, from the time it happened to the time I got off the runway, I couldn't put it in seconds for you, but quick. But if you're in the air, maybe you actually have more time to diagnose in the air. I mean, I guess you do, but depending on when it happened.
I feel like you might.
Yeah, I mean, if it happened,
you might have checked that if you were at 2,000 feet and that happened.
Yeah,
And
well,
like,
you
yeah,
definitely
okay.
want to get the
Well,
engine running
if you
more
were-
than solve a problem.
if you were anywhere other than like right after takeoff, I feel like you'd have time to figure that out. But if you're 100 feet off the ground,
You're not finding that. You're not
you're not-
troubleshooting at that point.
No.
Yeah. I mean, you're just looking for somewhere to ditch that thing at that point.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Exactly. And that's somewhat the mode, unfortunately, that I was in, because I had this I had limited options. Kind of. There's a guy coming in a Bonanza, and it was a wet off both sides. I couldn't just ditch. So, and I guess it doesn't really matter like what I really did, but my thought was I need to get this thing off the runway so this dude can land. That was like my only thought. And I don't know, but it's just weird how you can talk about all these things that you plan and you chair fly and whatever, and then when something happens in the moment, how much of that knowledge is just like, whatever. I'm just gonna meet the need right now and not go through all of these steps. Like you guys are saying, right after takeoff, you're just gonna land on that golf course, hopefully, or whatever is right there. That farmer's field.
So you were taking off to the north?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
At
So what
Port
would you have
Clinton.
done if you're at 100 foot?
That
This is
one.
PCW?
I mean, yeah. So it would have been basically try to get it back down. If not, I would have tried to like knife edge it back over and land to the west.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean-
It all would have sucked.
At that point, like, you're basically...
But then I would have looked awesome. This way, I just look stupid. If I would have pulled that off at 100 feet, have an engine failure, and then land on the other runway, then I'd look awesome. But
Yeah. If it went to that point, I would just turn the fuel valve back on and then be like, I have no idea. It just quit on me.
you,
'Cause you don't want to be like, oh, I had the fuel off.
yeah,
That's embarrassing. So you just be like,
Yeah.
yeah, I have no idea.
I think so. I talked to the mechanic who was working on it, and he's like, oh, I saw that all happen. It took 3 years off my life, and I'm like, it's not your fault. It's slick. It functions the way I'd want it to. It functions like it's a well-oiled, piece of mechanical thing. It's not this old clunky plastic fuel selector in like a newer Piper. It's a solid metal handle, and the fuel valve works really, really great. But the only issue with that I found, which I will now be more careful about, is that you need to be very precise in your placement. As soon as it clicks to that detent, you're done. You're absolutely done, and make sure that it's there. But I learned, and thankfully not the hard way, of how that one feels now and how it, I guess, functions, and maybe one of the pitfalls of being so. It just feels like lubricated. I mean, it just feels like a very good free movement, which I like.
You think that's how they felt originally? It's just now they're all so old, the ones we're using?
Man, I don't know. I've never felt any fuel selector valve that is felt as free moving as this one does. I like it, but that's something I guess that needs to be thought about,
Yeah.
It's not like I feel like if you had it firmly in the detent and you go through turbulence that it's going to go to off. I'm not in fear of that at all. But it is a very solid, I don't want to go like anything past like as soon as get it moving and then almost have no pressure on it so that when it stops, put no effort into it so that when it stops, when it clicks into the detent, it's got enough resistance that your hand stops. I don't know how to say that, but you can't put any real muscle into it, or you could easily take it past the precise detent and it would turn off. I don't know.
Scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, it opened my eyes. That's for sure.
My other question is, you said you pulled on the runway, held the brakes,
Mm-hmm.
and then released them.
Yep.
You taught me not to do it that way.
On a soft field takeoff.
So what's the difference?
Well, you don't want to sink into the mud. I was on a concrete runway.
Okay, but either way, I still feel like if you pulled onto that runway and kept your speed going as you added the power, full power, you're going to be better off than stopping, braking, full power.
So okay, so if you are very
Not in this
performance,
case.
if you're performance, not in the case.
Yeah.
If you're performance limited, and you normally suspect your engine and everything's going to be fine, your best case scenario is keep the momentum, especially in your case where you're kind of doing a 180-degree turn and then going. Yes.
You and I actually tried it both ways in the 150 because I did the brake hold thing, and you said, "Nah, don't do it that way." And we went and did it both. I don't know if you remember doing it, but
yeah, I do.
Yeah, the rolling start definitely worked better than the
you're taking
brakes.
5 or so miles an hour into your takeoff roll that you would ordinarily have.
Yeah.
This case, not having obstacles, not really. You would be 90% of the time correct. That would give you the shortest takeoff roll, and I mean, without getting out any significant, scientific measuring equipment and stuff, I'm pretty sure that's the quickest way to get off. Is the roll.
The rolling start. Yeah.
The rolling, yeah. I'm sure somebody can Google it and they'll find stuff that says otherwise, but done it a lot. I've always felt that's been the best. In this case, I wanted to make sure, since this airplane doesn't get flown regularly, I want to make sure I got a good scan on the engine instruments, that it was developing full RPM, oil pressure, oil temp, all that good stuff. That, in this case, was more important to me than every single, inch or second off the ground.
Yeah.
Because like what you and I were demoing is like, I only have 1,500 feet and I got an obstacle off the end. How am I going to do this? Me at 4,000 feet with no obstacles. So like I treated it differently.
It didn't really matter. Yeah.
No, and yes, your way, the way you're describing, I think would have been better for me getting off. But the
good thing you didn't get off sooner.
Yes, right, yeah, yeah. And I mean, and if I did, I would think I would have had
you
enough
probably
runway.
Still would have had enough. Yeah, even if you were 10 foot off the ground, you probably would have had enough runway to stop it.
But yeah, you don't want to get in that position. But yeah, so that's just the most recent exciting thing that's happened to me.
Yeah, that'd rattle me.
Yeah.
I don't know that it would, because I wasn't that rattled. I'm more upset with I am trying to self-diagnose that why I didn't go through kind of like the normal steps. Now, granted, I was actually doing something, so my faculties were much more constrained than they would have been. I think like in the air, you have a little bit of time. The emergency, or the only thing you need to do then is try to get the engine running, because you have some altitude to play with. Once you're kind of done diagnosing or trying to get the engine started, you're on to where can I put this thing down. I didn't have any of that. Like I had very limited outcomes. I wanted to get this thing clear of the runway. I kind of by happenstance found a way to do that. And if I didn't, I was going to stop on the runway. Those are the only two options. And when I brought the throttle to idle, I gave a quick look at carb heat and mixture. I did do that, but I didn't go through a check the prime or check the fuel upper tank. I didn't do all of that again, because in my mind I had already done that. Like that should be good, but and it wasn't. It was the fuel proper tank was the issue. I'm so confident, and I changed nothing else, but I heard that click, and I knew like, oh yeah, that was definitely it.
Yeah. Scary Larry.